Every person is, by definition, morally obligated to do what he feels is right. If a law tells him to do otherwise, that law is inherently illegitimate and should be disobeyed. And if a law happens to coincide with what is right, the law is simply irrelevant. The reason, for example, to refrain from committing murder is because murder is inherently wrong. Whether or not some politicians enacted legislation declaring murder to be wrong, whether or not they outlawed it, has no effect whatsoever on the morality of the act. Legislation, no matter what it says, is never the reason that something is good or bad. As a result, even laws prohibiting evil acts, such as assault, murder, and theft, are illegitimate. While people should not commit such acts, it is because the acts themselves are intrinsically evil, not because man-made laws say they are wrong. And if there is no obligation to obey the laws of the politicians, then by definition they have no authority. Returning to the math professor analogy, if the professor authoritatively declared that, by his mere decree, he was going to make 2 + 2 = 5, any sane individual would view that decree as incorrect and delusional. If, on the other hand, the professor declared that he was going to make 2 + 2 = 4, such a declaration would still be silly and pointless, even though 2 + 2 does equal 4. The professor's declaration is not the reason it equals 4. Either way, the professor's declaration would and should have no effect on the people's ability to add 2 and 2. And so it is with the laws of politicians. Whether or not they actually coincide with objective right and wrong, they never have authority, because they are never the source of right and wrong. They never create an obligation for anyone to behave a certain way, and so should have no bearing on what any individual judges to be moral or immoral. Consider the example of narcotics laws. To believe that it is bad to use violence against someone for having a beer, which is legal, but good for law enforcers to use violence against someone smoking pot because it is illegal, logically implies that politicians actually have the ability to alter morality. To take 2 essentially identical behaviors and make one into an immoral act that even justifies violent To take 2 essentially identical behaviors and make one into an immoral act that even justifies violent retribution. Moreover, if one accepts the legitimacy of laws, politician commands, one must also accept that drinking alcohol was perfectly moral one day, but was immoral the next day, the day prohibition was enacted. Then, not many years later, it was immoral one day and moral the next, the day prohibition was repealed. Even the gods of most religions do not claim the power to constantly amend and revise their commandments, to regularly change what is right and wrong. Only politicians claim such a power. Every act of legislation involves such lunacy. The notion that one day an act could be perfectly permissible, and the very next day, the day it was outlawed, it would be immoral. The unavoidability of judgment. Nearly everyone is taught that respect for the law is paramount to civilization, and that the good people are those who play by the rules, meaning they comply with the commands issued by governments. But in reality, morality and obedience are often direct opposites. Unthinking adherence to any authority constitutes the greatest betrayal to humanity that there could possibly be, as it seeks to discard the free will and individual judgment that make us human and make us capable of morality in favor of blind obedience, which reduces human beings to irresponsible robots. The belief in authority, the idea that the individual ever has an obligation to ignore his own judgment and decision-making process in favor of obeying someone else, is not just a bad idea. It is self-contradictory and absurd. The profound lunacy involved can be summed up as follows. I believe it's good to obey the law. In other words, I judge that I should do as the legislature's command. In other words, I judge that, rather than making my own decisions about what I should do, I should subjugate myself to the will of those in government. In other words, I judge that it is better for my actions to be dictated by the judgment of people in power instead of by my own personal judgment. In other words, I judge that it is right for me to follow the judgment of others, and wrong for me to follow my own judgment. In other words, I judge that I should not judge. In any case in which there is a conflict between a person's own conscience and what the law commands, there are only two options. Either the person ought to follow his own conscience, regardless of what the so-called law says, or he is obligated to obey the law, even though that means doing what he personally thinks is wrong. Regardless of whether the individual's judgment is flawed or not, it is schizophrenic insanity for a person to believe that it is good for him to do what he believes is bad. Yet that is the basis of the belief in authority. If one understands the fact that every individual is obligated at all times and in all places to do whatever he thinks is right, then he cannot have any moral obligation to obey any outside authority. Again, if a law coincides with the individual's judgment, the law is irrelevant. If, on the other hand, the law conflicts with his individual judgment, then the law must be viewed as illegitimate. Either way, the law has no authority. An obligation to obey an authority is not the same as people voluntarily altering their behavior for the sake of peaceful coexistence. For example, a person may think he has every right to play music in his own backyard, but may nonetheless choose not to at his neighbor's request. Or a person may change how he dresses, talks, and behaves when he visits some other culture, or some setting where his usual behavior might offend others. There are many factors which can impact someone's opinion about what he should or should not do. Recognizing authority as a myth is not at all the same as not caring what anyone else thinks. Going along with various customs, standards of behavior, and other societal norms, for the sake of getting along and avoiding conflicts, is often a perfectly rational and useful thing to do. What is not rational is for someone to feel morally obligated to do something he does not personally judge to be the right thing to do, given the circumstance. To be blunt, the belief in authority serves as a mental crutch for people seeking to escape the responsibility involved with being a thinking human being. It is an attempt to pass off the responsibility for decision-making to someone else, those claiming to be authority. But the attempt to avoid responsibility by just following orders, quote-unquote, is silly because it requires the person to choose to do what he was told. Even what appears as blind obedience is still the result of the individual choosing to be obedient. Not choosing anything is not possible. Or, as the band Rush put it in their song Free Will, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. The excuse, "I was only following orders," neatly dodges the fact that the person first had to decide that he would obey authority. Even if some authority proclaims, "You must obey me," as countless conflicting authorities have claimed, the individual still must choose which one, if any, to believe. The fact that most people give very little thought to such things does not change the fact that they have the option of not obeying, and are therefore completely responsible for their actions. Precisely the responsibility they wanted authority to relieve them of. It is impossible not to judge. It is impossible not to make choices. For a person to pretend that someone or something else made his choices for him, that he played no part in the decision and thus bears no responsibility for the outcome, is utterly insane. Loyal obedience to authority, while painted by many as great virtue, is really nothing more than a pathetic attempt to escape the responsibility of human being and reduce oneself to an unthinking, amoral, programmable machine. Everyone at all times makes his own choices and is personally responsible for those choices. Even those who hallucinate an authority are still choosing to believe and choosing to obey and are still responsible for having done so. Authority is merely a delusion whereby people imagine that it is possible to avoid responsibility by merely doing what they were told. Or, to express it in a more personal way, your actions are always determined entirely by your own judgment and your own choices. To try to attribute your behavior to some outside force, such as authority, is cowardly and dishonest. You made the choice, and you are responsible. Even if you just stupidly obeyed some self-proclaimed authority, you decided to do that. The claim that there was something outside of yourself making your choices for you, the claim that you had no choice, that you had to obey authority, is a cowardly lie. There is no shortcut to determining truth about morality or anything else. All too often, the basis of people's belief system boils down to this. To know what is true, all I have to do is ask my infallible authority. And I know my authority is always right because it tells me that it is always right. Of course, countless competing, contradictory authorities will always exist, and each will declare itself to be the source of truth. It is therefore not merely a good idea for people to judge for themselves what is true and what is not. It is completely unavoidable. Even those who consider it a great virtue to have a belief system, political, religious, or otherwise, based upon faith, fail to realize that only an individual can decide what to have faith in. Whether he wants to admit it or not, he is always the ultimate decider. He always uses his own judgment to decide what to believe and what to do. He and she. Part 3. The effects of the superstition. Effects of the myth. Throughout the ages, human beings have done... Throughout the ages, human beings have done to all sorts of superstitions. Human beings have something to all sorts of superstitions and false assumptions, many of them relatively harmless. Have clung. Oh, they put a D instead of a CL. So we'll start here. Throughout the ages, human beings have clung to all sorts of superstitions and false assumptions, many of them relatively harmless. For example, when most people believed the earth to be flat, the factually incorrect notion had little or no impact on how people lived their daily lives, or how they treated one another. Likewise, if children believe in the tooth fairy or that storks deliver babies, they are not going to become purveyors of evil as a result of accepting such myths. On the other hand, over the years, other false assumptions and myths have posed real dangers to humanity. It could be a simple misunderstanding among doctors, which led them to try cures that posed a bigger threat to their patients than the maladies they were trying to treat. As a more drastic example, some cultures offered up human sacrifices in the hope that doing so would win the favor of their imaginary gods. But nothing else comes close to the level of destruction, mental, emotional, and physical, that has occurred throughout the world and throughout recorded history as a result of the belief in authority. By dramatically altering how people perceive the world, the myth of authority alters their thoughts and actions as well. In fact, the belief in the legitimacy of a ruling class, government, leads nearly everyone to either condone or commit acts of evil without even realizing it. Having been convinced that authority is real and that by way of it some human beings have acquired the moral right to initiate violence and commit acts of aggression against others by way of so-called laws, every Democrat, every Republican, every voter, and everyone else who advocates government in any form is a proponent of violence and injustice. Of course, they do not see it that way, because their belief in authority has warped and perverted their perception of reality. The trouble is that when something alters a person's perception of reality, the person rarely notices it happening. For example, the world might look very different to someone wearing colored contact lenses, even though he cannot see the lenses themselves. The same is true of mental lenses. Each person thinks that the world is really the way he sees it. Everyone can point to others and claim that they are out of touch with reality, but almost no one thinks that his own perception is skewed, even when others tell him so. The result is billions of people pointing fingers at each other, telling each other how delusional and misguided they are, with almost none of them willing or even able to honestly examine the lenses that distort their own perceptions. Everything a person has been exposed to, especially when young, has an impact on how he views the world. What his parents taught him, what he learned in school, how he has seen people behaving, the culture he grew up in, the religion he was raised in, all creates a long-lasting set of mental lenses that affect how he sees the world. There are countless examples of how mere differences in perspective have led to horrendous consequences. A suicide bomber who initially kills dozens of civilian strangers imagines that he is doing the right thing. Nearly everyone on both sides of every war imagines himself to be doing or being in the right. No one imagines himself to be the bad guy. Military conflicts are entirely the result of differences in perspective resulting from mental lenses that have been trained into the soldiers on both sides. It should be self-evident that if thousands of basically good people were all seeing the world as it is, they would not be desperately trying to kill each other. In most cases, the problem is not actual evil or malice, but simply an inability to see things as they are. Consider, as an analogy, someone who has ingested a strong hallucinogen and who, as a result, becomes convinced that his best friend is really a malicious alien monster in disguise. From the perspective of the one having the hallucinations, violently attacking his friend is perfectly reasonable and justified. The problem, in the case of one whose perception of reality has been so distorted, is not that he is immortal, or that he is stupid, or that he is malicious. The problem is that he is not seeing things as they actually are. And as a result, decisions and actions which seem perfectly appropriate to him are in reality horribly destructive. And when such a hallucination is shared by many, the results become far worse. When everyone has the same misperception of reality, when everyone believes something untrue, even something patently absurd, it doesn't feel untrue or absurd to them. When a false or illogical idea is constantly repeated and reinforced by nearly everyone, it rarely occurs to anyone to even begin to question it. In fact, most people become literally incapable of questioning it because over time it becomes solidified in their minds as a given. An assumption that doesn't need a rational basis and doesn't need to be analyzed or reconsidered because everyone knows it to be true. In reality, however, each person simply assumes it to be true because he cannot imagine that everyone else, including all the respectable, well-known, educated people on the radio and TV, could all believe something false. What business does one average individual have doubting something which everyone else seems perfectly comfortable accepting as indisputable truth? Such a deeply entrenched belief is invisible to those who believe it. When a mind has always thought of something in one way, the mind will imagine evidence and hallucinate experience supporting the idea. 1,000 years ago, people would have confidently proclaimed that it was a proven fact that the earth was flat, and they would have said it with just as much certainty and honesty as we now proclaim it to be round. To them, the idea of the world being a giant spherical thing floating around in space and attached to nothing was patently ridiculous, and their utterly false assumption about the world being flat would have seemed to them to be a scientific self-evident fact. So it is with the belief in authority and government. Excuse me, sippy. So it is with the belief in authority and government. To most people, government feels like an obvious reality, as rational and self-evident as gravity. Few people have ever objectively examined the concept because they have never had the reason to. Everyone knows that government is real and necessary and legitimate and unavoidable. Everyone assumes that it is and talks as if it is. So why would anyone question it? Not only are people rarely given a reason to examine the concept of government, but they have a very compelling psychological incentive to not examine it. It is exceedingly uncomfortable and disturbing, even and existentially terrifying, for someone to call into question one of the bedrock assumptions upon which his entire view of reality and his entire moral code has been based for all of his life. One whose perception and judgment have been distorted by the superstition of authority, and that describes nearly everyone, will not find it easy or pleasant to contemplate the possibility that his entire belief system is based upon a lie, and that much of what he has done throughout his life as a result of believing that lie has been harmful to himself and his friends and his family and humanity in general. In short, the belief in authority and government warps the perception of almost every person, skews his judgment, and leads him to say and do things which are often irrational or pointless or counterproductive or hypocritical or even horribly destructive and heinously evil. Of course, the believers in the myth do not see it that way because they do not see it as a belief at all. They are firmly convinced that authority is real, and based on the false assumption conclude their resulting perceptions, thoughts, opinions, and actions are perfectly reasonable, justifiable, and proper, just as the Aztecs no doubt believed their human sacrifices to be reasonable, justifiable, and proper. A superstition capable of making otherwise decent people view good as evil, and evil as good, which is exactly what the belief in authority does, is what poses the real threat to humanity. The superstition of authority affects the perceptions and actions of different people in different ways, whether it be the lawmakers who imagine themselves to have the right to rule, the law enforcers who imagine themselves to have the right and obligation to enforce the commands of the lawmakers, the subjects who imagine themselves to have the moral duty to obey, or mere spectators looking on as neutral observers. The effect of the belief in authority on these various groups, when taken together, leads to a degree of oppression, injustice, theft, and murder which simply could not and would not otherwise exist. Part 3a. The effects of the myth on the masters. I'm at page 45, by the way. The divine right of politician. In this country, at the top of the gang called government, are the congressmen, presidents, and judges. In other countries, the rulers are known by other names, such as kings, emperors, or members of parliament. And though they are at the top of the authoritarian organization, they are not perceived to be authority itself, the way kings used to be. They are still imagined to be acting on behalf of something other than themselves, some abstract entity called government. As a result of the belief in authority, they are imagined to have rights to do things in the name of government that none of them have the right to do as individuals. The legitimacy of their actions is measured not by what they do, but by how they do it. In most people's eyes, the actions that politicians take in their official capacity and the commands they issue by way of the accepted political rituals are judged by a very different standard than are their actions as private individuals. If a congressman breaks into his neighbor's home and takes $1,000, he is seen as a criminal. If, on the other hand, together with his fellow politicians, he imposes a tax, demanding the same $1,000 from the same neighbor, it is seen as legitimate. What would have been armed robbery would then be viewed by almost everyone as legitimate taxation. Not only would the congressman not be viewed as a crook, but any tax cheats who resisted his extortionist demands would be considered the criminals. But the belief in authority not only changes how lawmakers are viewed by the masses, it also changes how lawmakers view themselves. It should be obvious that if a person becomes convinced that he has the moral right to rule over others, that belief will have a significant effect upon his behavior. If he believes that he has the right to demand a portion of everyone's income under threat of punishment, provided he does it through accepted legal procedures, he will almost certainly do so. If he is convinced that he has the right to coercively control the decisions of his neighbors, that it is moral and legitimate for him to do so, he almost certainly will. And at least at first, he may even do so with the best of intentions. A simple mental exercise gives a glimpse into how and why politicians act the way they do. Think about what you would do if you were made king of the world. If you were in charge, how would you improve things? Consider the question carefully before reading on. When asked what would they do if they were in charge, almost no one answers, "I would just leave people alone." Instead, most people start imagining the ways in which they could use the ability to control people as a tool for good, for the betterment of mankind. If one starts with the assumption that such control can be legitimate and righteous, the possibilities are nearly endless. One could make a healthier country by forcing people to eat more nutritious foods and exercise regularly. One could help the poor by forcing the rich to give them money. One could make the people safer by forcing them to pay for a strong system of defense. One could make things more equitable and society more compassionate by forcing people to behave the way they should. However, while many positive benefits for society can be imagined, if only government power were used for good, the potential for tyranny and oppression, in fact, the inevitability of tyranny and oppression, is just as easy to imagine. Once someone believes himself to have the right to control others, there is little likelihood that he will choose not to use that power. And whatever noble intentions he may have had to begin with, what he will actually end up doing is using violence and the threat of violence to impose his will upon others. Even seemingly benevolent causes like giving to the poor first require government to forcibly take wealth from another. Once someone, however virtuous and well-intentioned he may be, has accepted the premise that legal aggression is legitimate, and once he has been given the reins of power, and with them the supposed right to rule, the chances of that person choosing not to forcibly control his neighbors is almost none. The level of coercion and violence he inflicts upon others may vary, but he will become a tyrant, to one degree or another. Because once someone truly believes that he has the right to rule, even if only in a limited manner, he will not view others or treat others as equals. He will view them and treat them as subjects. And that is if a person started with good intentions. Many of those who seek high office do it for purely selfish reasons from the start, because they desire wealth and power for themselves and delight in dominating other people. Of course, acquiring a position of authority is, for such people, a means of achieving an enormous amount of power that they would not have otherwise. The examples throughout the world and throughout history of megalomaniacs using the facade of authority to commit heinous atrocities are so common and well known that they hardly require mentioning at all. Putting evil people into positions of authority, e.g., Stalin, Lenin, Mao, Hitler, Mussolini, Pol Pot, has resulted in the robbery, assault, harassment, terrorization, torture, and outright murder of a nearly incomprehensible number of human beings. It is so obvious that it is almost silly to even say it. Giving power to bad people poses a danger to humanity. Giving power to good people, people who at least initially intend to use their power for good, can be just as dangerous, because for one to believe that he has the right to rule necessarily requires him to believe that he is exempt from basic human morality. When someone imagines himself to be a legitimate lawmaker, he will try to use the force of law to control his neighbors, and will feel no guilt while doing so. Ironically, though, lawmakers are at the very top of the authoritarian hierarchy. Even they do not accept personal responsibility for what government does. Even they speak as if the law is something other than the commands they issue. For example, it is very unlikely that any politician would feel justified hiring armed thugs to invade his neighbor's home. and drag his neighbor away and put him in a cage for the supposed sin of smoking marijuana. Yet many politicians have advocated exactly that via anti-drug legislation. They seem to feel no shame or guilt regarding the fact that their legislation has resulted in millions of non-violent people being forcibly taken from their friends and families and made to live in cages for years on end, sometimes for the rest of their lives. When they speak of the acts of violence which they are directly responsible for, and narcotics laws are only one example, legislatures use terms such as the law of the land, quote unquote, as if they themselves are mere spectators and the land, or the country, or the people were the ones who made such violence occur. Indeed, the politicians' level of psychological detachment from what they have personally and directly caused via their laws borders on insanity. They command armies of tax collectors to forcibly confiscate the wealth earned by hundreds of millions of people. They enact one intrusive law after another, using threats of violence to control every aspect of the lives of millions of people they have never met and know nothing about. And after they have been directly responsible for initiating violence on a regular basis against nearly everyone living within hundreds or thousands of miles of them, they are genuinely shocked and offended if one of their victims threatens to use violence against them. They consider it despicable for a mere peasant to even threaten to do what they, the politicians, do to millions of people every day. At the same time, they do not even seem to notice the millions of people who are imprisoned, whose property is stolen, whose financial lives are ruined, whose freedom and dignity are assaulted, who are harassed, attacked, and sometimes murdered by government thugs, as a direct result of the very laws those politicians created. When young men and women are dying by the thousands in the latest war game waged on by politicians, the politicians speak of it as a sacrifice for freedom, when it is nothing of the sort. The politicians even use scenes of soldiers in caskets, a consequence directly attributable to what those politicians did, as photo ops to show the public how concerned and compassionate they are. The very people who sent the young folk off to kill or to die, then speak about what happened as if they themselves were mere observers, saying things like they died for their country and they are casualties in every war, as if the war just happened by itself. And of course, the thousands upon thousands of people on the other side, the subjects of some other authority, the citizens of some other country, who are killed in the wars waged by the politicians, are barely even mentioned. They are an occasional statistic reported on the evening news, and never do the politicians accept the smallest shred of responsibility for the widespread, large-scale, prolonged pain and suffering excuse me, mental and physical, which their warmongering has inflicted upon thousands or millions of human beings. Sippy, sippy. Again, the depth of their denial and complete evasion of personal responsibility can be seen in the fact that if one of the victims of the politicians' war games decides to attack the source, oh, this is good, by directly targeting the ones who gave the orders to attack, all of the politicians, even those claiming to be against the war, and all of the talking heads on television express shock and outrage that anyone would do something so despicable. This is because, in the eyes of lawmakers, due to the amazing power of the authority myth to completely warp and distort their perception of reality, when they do things which result in the deaths of thousands of innocents, that is, the unfortunate cost of war. But when one of their victims tries to strike back at the source, it is terrorism. It is bad enough for those who are just obeying orders to deny personal responsibility for their actions, which is addressed below. But for those actually giving the orders and making up the orders to deny any responsibility for what their orders directly caused to happen is sheer lunacy. Yet that is what lawmakers always do, on every level. Whether it is the federal government, or some local township, or borough council, every time a legislature imposes a tax on something or imposes some new legal restriction, the politicians are using the threat of violence to control people. But due to their undying faith in the myth of authority, they cannot see that that is what they are doing, and they never take personal responsibility for having threatened and extorted their neighbors. Part 3b. The effects of the myth on the enforcers. Following orders. The lawmakers give the commands, but it is their faithful enforcers who carry them out. Millions upon millions of otherwise decent, civilized people spend day after day harassing, threatening, extorting, controlling, bullying, and otherwise oppressing others who have not harmed or threatened anyone. But because the action of such law enforcers are deemed legal, and because they believe they are acting on behalf of authority, they imagine themselves to bear no responsibility for their actions. Worse yet, they do not even view their own actions as being their own actions. They speak and act as if their minds and bodies have somehow been taken over by some invisible entity called the law or government. They say things like, "Hey, I don't make the laws, I just enforce them. It's not up to me." They speak and act as if it is impossible for them to do anything other than helplessly carry out the will of the power called authority, and that they are therefore no more personally responsible for their actions than a puppet is responsible for what the puppeteer makes it do. Excuse me. When acting in their official capacity, while seemingly helplessly possessed by the spirit of authority, law enforcers behave in ways which they never otherwise would, and do things that they themselves would recognize as uncivilized, violent, and evil, if they did such things of their own volition, without any authority telling them to. Examples of this occur all over the world, every hour of every day, in a wide variety of ways. A soldier might shoot a complete stranger, whose only sin was to be out walking in a military-occupied zone after a declared curfew. A group of heavily armed men might kick down someone's door and drag him away, or shoot a man in front of his wife and children, because the man grew a plant which politicians proclaimed to be forbidden, illegal. A bureaucrat might file paperwork instructing a financial institution to take thousands of dollars out of someone's bank account in the name of tax collection. Another bureaucrat may send in armed thugs upon finding out that someone had the gall to build a deck on his own property, with the approval of his neighbors, but without the government approval, in the form of a building permit. A traffic cop may stop and extort someone via a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt. A TSA agent may rummage through someone's personal belongings without the slightest reason to suspect that the person has done or is going to do anything wrong. A judge may direct armed thugs to put someone in a cage for weeks, months, or years for anything from showing contempt for the judge to driving without the written permission of politicians in the form of a driver's license, to having engaged in any type of mutually voluntary but non-politician sanctioned illegal commerce. These examples, and literally millions of others which could be given, are acts of aggression committed by perpetrators who would not have committed them if they had not been directed to do so by a perceived authority. In short, most instances of theft, assault, and murder happen only because authority told someone to steal, attack, or kill. Most of the time, the people who carry out such orders would not have committed such crimes on their own. Of the 100,000 people who work for the Internal Revenue Service, how many engaged in harassment, extortion, and theft before becoming IRS agents? How many engaged in those things before becoming IRS agents? Few, if any. How many soldiers went around harassing, threatening, or killing people they did not know before joining the military? Few, if any. How many police officers regularly went around stopping, interrogating, and kidnapping nonviolent people before becoming law enforcers? Very few. How many judges had people thrown into cages for nonviolent behavior before being appointed to a court? Probably none. When such acts of aggression become legal and are done in the name of law enforcement, those who commit them imagine such acts to be inherently legitimate and valid, even though they recognize that, had they committed the very same acts on their own, instead of on behalf of an imagined authority, the acts would have constituted crimes, and would have been immoral. While there are obviously more significant and less significant cogs in the wheels of the government machine, from low-level paper pushers to armed mercenaries, they all have two things in common. One, they inflict unpleasantness on others in a way they would not have done on their own. And two, they accept no personal responsibility for their actions while in law enforcer mode. Nothing makes this more obvious than the fact that when the properness or morality of their actions is called into question, their response is almost always some variation of, "I'm just doing my job." The obvious implication in all such statements is this: I am not responsible for my actions because authority told me to do this. The only way that makes a shred of sense is if the person is literally incapable of refusing to do something a perceived authority tells them to do. Unfortunately, the horrific truth is that most people, as a result of their authoritarian indoctrination, do seem to be psychologically incapable of disobeying the commands of an imagined authority. Most people, given the choice between doing what they know is right and doing what they know is wrong, when ordered to do so by a perceived authority, will do the latter. Nothing demonstrates this more dearly than the results of the psychology experiments done by Dr. Stanley Milgram in the 1960s. The Milgram experiments. In brief, the Milgram studies were designed to determine to what degree ordinary people would inflict pain upon strangers simply because an authority figure told them to. For the complete description of the experiments and the results, see Dr. Milgram's book. That's M like Mary, I-L, G like girl, R-A-M like Mary, S. Obedience to Authority. The following is a short synopsis of his experiments and findings. Subjects were asked to volunteer for what they were told was an experiment testing human memory. Under the supervision of a scientist, the authority figure, one person was strapped into a chair and wired with electrodes, and the other, the actual subject of the study, sat in front of a shock-generating machine. The person in front of the zapper machine was told that the goal was to test whether shocking the person when he gave the wrong answer to a memorization question would affect his ability to remember things. The true goal, however, was to test to what degree the person in front of the zapper machine would inflict pain on an innocent stranger simply because someone in the role of authority told him to. I would have so failed that. The zapper machine had a series of switches going up to 450 volts, and the zapper subject was supposed to increase the voltage and administer another shock each time the zappee got an answer wrong. In truth, the zappee in the test was an actor who was not being shocked at all, but at given voltage levels would give out shouts of pain, protests about heart troubles, demands to stop the experiment, screams for mercy, and eventually silence, feigning unconsciousness or death. In addition, the zapper machine was clearly marked with danger labels at the upper level end of the series of switches. The results of the experiment shocked even Dr. Milgram. In short, a significant majority of subjects, nearly 2 out of 3, continued through the experiment right to the end, inflicting what they thought were excruciatingly painful, if not lethal, shocks to a complete stranger, despite the screams of agony, the cries for mercy, even the unconsciousness or death of the pretending victim. Dr. Milgram himself succinctly sums up the conclusion to be reached. Quote, with numbing regularity, good people were seen to knuckle under the demands of authority and perform actions that were callous and severe. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. End quote. Of note, in the experiments, there was no threat that the zapper person would be punished for failure to obey, nor was there any special reward promised for obedience. So the results were not merely showing that an ordinary person might hurt someone else to save his own neck, or might hurt someone else if they somehow profited himself. Instead, the results showed that most people will inflict excruciating pain, even death, upon an innocent stranger for no other reason than he was told to do so by a perceived authority. This point cannot be overstressed. There is a particular belief that leads basically good people to do bad things, even heinously evil things. Even the atrocities of Hitler's Third Reich were the result not of millions of evil people, but of a very small handful of truly evil people who had acquired positions of authority, and millions of obedient people who merely did what the perceived authority told them to do. In her book about Hitler's top bureaucrat, Adolf Eichmann, sometimes called the architect of the Holocaust, author Hannah Arendt used the phrase the banality of evil to refer to the fact that most evil is not the result of personal malice or hatred, but merely the result of blind obedience. Individuals giving up their own free will and judgment in favor of unthinking subservience to an imagined authority. Interestingly, both Arendt's book and Dr. Milgram's experiments offended a lot of people. The reason is simple. People who have been taught to respect authority and have been taught that obedience is a virtue and that cooperating with authority is what makes us civilized do not like to hear the truth, which is that truly evil people, with all their malice and hatred, pose far less of a threat to mankind than the basically good people who believe in authority. Anyone who honestly examines the results of Dr. Milgram's experiments cannot escape the fact of reality. But aside from the general lesson to be learned from the Milgram experiments, that most people will intentionally hurt other people if perceived authority tells them to, several other findings from Milgram's work are worth noting. 1. Many of the subjects of the experiments showed signs of stress, guilt, and anguish while inflicting pain on others, and yet continued to do so. This fact demonstrates that these were not simply nasty sadists waiting for an excuse to hurt others. They did not enjoy doing it. Furthermore, it shows that the people knew that they were doing something wrong and did it anyway because authority told them to. Some subjects protested, begged to be allowed to stop, trembled uncontrollably, even cried, and yet most continued to the end of the experiment. The conclusion could hardly be more obvious. The belief in authority makes good people commit evil. 2. The subject's income level, education level, age, sex, and other demographic factors seem to have little or no influence on the results. Statistically speaking, a rich, cultured, educated young woman will obey an authoritarian command to hurt someone else just as readily as an illiterate, poor, male manual laborer will. The one common factor shared by all of those who continued to the end of the experiment is that they believed in authority, obviously. Again, the message to be learned, however troubling it may be, is logically inescapable. Regardless of almost any other factors, the belief in authority turns good people into agents of evil. 3. The average person, when the experiment is described to him, not including the results, guesses that the compassion and conscience of most people would prevent them from continuing through the entire experiment. Professional psychiatrists predicted that only about 1 in 1,000 would obey to the end of the experiment, when in reality it was about 65%. And when the average person who has not actually been tested is asked if he personally would have gone to the end of the study if he had been tested, he usually insists that he would not have. Yet the majority do. Again, the message is troubling but indisputable. Almost everyone hugely underestimates the degree to which the belief in authority, even in himself, can be used to persuade people, good people, to commit evil. 4. Dr. Milgram also found that some test subjects, defying all reason, were determined to blame the results of their own blind obedience on the victim, the one being shocked. In other words, through whatever twisted mentality it took, some of those doing the shocking imagined that the one being shocked was somehow to blame for his own suffering. With that in mind, it should come as no surprise that when police officers are caught assaulting innocent civilians, or when soldiers are caught terrorizing or murdering civilians, or when prison guards are caught torturing prisoners, their defense is often to blame the victim, no matter how much the authoritarian aggressors have to mangle the truth and logic in order to do so. No matter how much they have to mangle the truth to do so. Excuse me. Interestingly, even though at the Nuremberg trials, just following orders was not accepted as a valid excuse for what the Nazis did, it is still the standard response from countless soldiers, police, tax collectors, bureaucrats, and other representatives of authority. Whenever the morality of their behavior is questioned, both in Milgram's experiments and in countless real-life abuses of power, those who intentionally hurt others simply fall back on the standard excuse, claiming that they were not personally responsible because they were merely following orders. In the Milgram experiment, several subjects even directly asked the authority figure which of them was responsible for what was happening. When the authority figure said that he was the one responsible, most subjects went on without further debate, apparently comfortable with the notion that whatever happened from then on was not their fault and they would not be held liable. Again, the message is difficult to escape. The belief in authority allows basically good people to disassociate themselves from the evil acts they themselves commit, relieving them of any feeling of personal responsibility. 5. When it was left up to the zapper person what voltage to use, only very rarely would he go above 150 volts. The point at which the one pretending to be shocked said he did not want to go on. It is very important to note that up to that point, and almost all subjects made it to that point, the zappy guy let out grunts of pain, but did not ask for the experiment to stop. As a result, the one doing the zapping could quite reasonably say that the one being zapped had agreed to the arrangement, and up to that point was still a willing participant. Interestingly, of the few subjects who did not go all the way to the end, many of them stopped as soon as the zappee said he wanted out. This could be dubbed as the libertarian line, since once the zappee asked to be unstrapped, for the zapper to continue anyway constitutes initiating violence against another, the exact thing libertarians oppose. Unfortunately, those who stop at the libertarian line are only a small minority of the population. As for the rest, the findings are disturbingly clear. Of the people who would, at the behest of authority, shock someone who calmly said, "I don't want to do this anymore," most would continue inflicting pain, even if the victim was screaming in agony. Is this because most people are evil? No. It is because they have been conditioned to do as they are told and have been indoctrinated into the most dangerous superstition of all, the belief in authority. It should be noted that even Dr. Milgram could not escape his own indoctrination into the cult of the authority worship. In passing, with very little comment, even he opined that we cannot have a society without some structure of authority. He made a weak attempt to defend teaching obedience to authority by saying, quote, "Obedience is often rational. It makes good sense to follow the doctor's orders, to obey traffic signs, and to clear the building when the police informs us of a bomb threat," unquote. Yet none of those examples actually requires or justifies a belief in authority. Despite the way people often talk, doctors do not give orders. They are authorities in the sense that they are knowledgeable in the field of medicine, but not in the sense of having any right to rule. As for the other examples, the main reason to observe the rules of the road or to leave a building with the bomb in it is not because obedience authority is a virtue, but because the alternative is injury or death. If some non-authority in a theater pulled the bomb from under his seat, held it up for all to see and said, "A bomb, let's get out of here," would everyone else stay where they were because the person was not perceived as an authority? Of course not. And if government repealed the law saying which side of the road everyone should drive on, would people start randomly swerving around? Of course not. They would keep driving on the right side because they do not want to crash into each other. So, although even Dr. Milgram clung to the notion that the belief in authority is sometimes necessary and good, he gave no rational argument to support such an assertion. It is a testament to the strength of the myth of authority that even someone who had witnessed what Dr. Milgram had witnessed was still unable to completely give up the superstition. After Dr. Milgram publicized his findings, many were shocked and dismayed by the extent to which normal people were willing to inflict pain or death upon innocent strangers when instructed to do so by a perceived authority. Similar tests performed since Dr. Milgram's experiments have yielded similar results, which continue to shock some people. However, the results really should not be surprising to anyone who has taken a look at how most human beings are being raised. And with that, thank you for watching and listening. Number 4 should be out in a week or so. Thank you.